Hey guys, welcome. We're going to talk about AMD today. AMD is another one of these tech stocks that's gotten beaten down in this recent inflation scare. That's really beaten up tech stocks while the rest of the market's actually done pretty well. And so I think there's a lot of potential buying opportunities out there right now in tech. Personally, I think that the inflation fear is now subsiding. I think we've probably hit the bottom in that. And so I think it's a great time to be looking for bargains, shopping for value stocks in that particular space, and that's what I've been spending a lot of my time doing over the last little while. AMD is absolutely on anybody's radar, I think, if you're looking for beaten down tech stocks that are good, solid businesses. And really, in that analysis, it's about picking a good entry point, right? Is the current valuation really attractive? Does the future look good? You know what's going on there. So I want to look at all that stuff. We got to talk about the valuation. We got to talk about this merger news with Xilinx. They're acquiring a company, so we got to understand what that means for the future for AMD. We have to take a look at what's brought them to this point, so recent history. And really, there's some catalysts coming up and some new lines of business that really affect the balance of the bull and the bear case that I'm going to try to build up here. That's how I want to do this one, right? I want to try to build up a bull case. There's a number of points here on the good news side of the ledger, and I want to try to make a bear case for the stock here and see why we might want to be careful about some of the downside risk. So I've prepared 4 or 5 points on each side. Let's get into it and take a look. So in terms of the company story, AMD has a long history, right? I mean, they go back to the 70s timeframe, but really the business that we are dealing with today mostly started from a reorganization that they did back in 2014. They shook up the business and restructured into 2 primary lines. One is their computing business, which is both end user PC, desktop market type stuff, and to a lesser extent the server market. And then the graphics business, which is the graphics processors and all the components associated with that. And so that's been their bread and butter since 2014. And now it's brought them to this point where there's yet another restructuring and an inflection point, I think, in their business in terms of the merger that they're heading into now with Xilinx. So we got to talk about that as well. Now, if we take a quick look at where they sit today, they're a big company, right? They're a market cap of just over 90 billion right now. And the stock has had a bit of a rocky history. We're looking at a 3-year chart here, and you can see where the climb really started in the latter part of 2019. They've been a strong uptrend since then, and with some pretty fantastic stuff happening in July when there were some new product announcements and things like that. And that brought us into a sideways trading range that's mostly continued here since August of 2020. And then really this portion here is that downward trend that we've lived through over the last couple of months with these inflation scares. So probably the most interesting part of this chart here is what happened back in July of 2020. So AMD went through 3 really big things that all happened at once at that point. Intel had some bad news. They started to experience some production delays. AMD had a really awesome second quarter. And it was that point they introduced the new Zen 2 desktop processor. So it all came together at once, right? They had a ton of good news. And I think that the revenue growth that we have seen over the last little while, it really started there, right? When they announced that second quarter results back then, it was really, really good. And that momentum has continued up to the present day. And it's not showing any signs of subsiding, even though the stock has mostly traded sideways since that point. It's been a little bit range bound. And so I think that's really where the opportunity potentially is coming from here. We're still seeing momentum in the business, but it's not really accompanied by the same momentum you'd expect to see in the stock price. I think it's depressed due to that whole inflation scare and a number of other things. And I think that's potentially what's creating an opportunity. That's what I want to take a look at here in the bull and bear cases.
What's the upside potential?
Okay, point number 1 in the bull case here is the Xilinx acquisition, the merger news here. This first broke back in October of 2020. And last month in April, the merger was approved. Shareholders on both companies voted in favor of it. It's a $35 billion all-stock deal. It's going to create a combined company, and then shareholders in each company are going to own a portion of the new company go forward. Okay, so what does Xilinx do, right? So they make a type of a microprocessor called an FPGA, and this is a field programmable gate array. Now, these are a specialized type of device. We typically don't see them in the kinds of devices that AMD manufactures. You don't see these gate arrays in desktop markets. You don't see them in GPUs typically and that kind of thing. So it's not really about adding that technology to their current lines of business. It's about getting into a new line of business and opening up a new opportunity. And, where AMD wants to take the FPGA solutions and the market that Xilinx has is absolutely into automotive. It's into 5G. It's into Internet of Things. So I think that's what we're going to see here. AMD is seeing this as an opportunity to open up an entirely new line of business with FPGA technology that's going to be required in these emerging solutions, that folks need in 5G, IoT, the EV market. It's going to need those in-car systems and those dedicated microprocessors that are going to need FPGA technology. And, from there it can be built up to include aspects of AMD solutions, right, in terms of processors and that kind of thing. And it's really going to bring together AMD's expertise in traditional microprocessor architecture and embedded systems. And I think it's going to actually open up that market for them. That's really the strategy here that they're heading towards with the Xilinx merger. Some great news in terms of stock buybacks. This is not something typically that AMD does. I think they did one several years ago, but last week they announced a $4 billion stock buyback. And really the best news here is that the buyback is not going to be funded by debt. It's going to be funded by free cash flow, which is coincidentally right around $4 billion this year, right? So basically AMD management is saying, hey, we have $4 billion of free cash flow coming in, and we think the very best way to use that is to buy back shares of our own company. So not only is this good for shareholders, but it's really, really good in terms of a vote of confidence for the future in the business. They absolutely believe that this is the best value if the cash go forward. Sometimes these buybacks are just announcements, right? And they don't actually materialize in a lot of shares being bought back. I don't think that's the case here for AMD. If you look what happened in their previous buyback, they did in fact buy it back. A skeptic could claim that it's an announcement to support the share price in the face of the decline that's happened a little while. Could be. I don't really see it though, given that free cash flow is projected to continue to increase. It's increased strongly over the last couple of quarters. And especially with the merger, it's going to be at least neutral, if not accretive, to revenue and to earnings. So, I think that the buyback is quite likely to continue into 2022 as well, and that should support the share price go forward again. So I think the buyback news is really, really bullish for investors. The third point here is the valuation. Especially as the stock has slipped over the last little while, I think the valuation's gotten pretty good. If we go down here and take a look at the PE, so this puts them at just under a 32 PE, whereas the industry average is up over 47. I think it's a good story. I think the PEG, not as applicable to a large cap company, right? But it's still a good number. Price to sales is reasonable. Price to cash flow is good. So by any reasonable valuation metric, these guys are trading favorably in respect to, the industry valuations. And they're showing fantastic return on assets, return on equity, return on investment. Margins are really, really good. And if you look at the growth rates that they've experienced in terms of sales, right, like we're seeing really massive increases in EPS. We're seeing really, really healthy increases in sales. And you can see that in the chart here too. Over the last little while, since 2018, sales have been shooting up. And even quarterly over the last few quarters, we've seen that strong growth, right? So in a big company like AMD, momentum is absolutely a thing in terms of sales and revenue growth and the valuation. So given that we're seeing this strength in the numbers and not really accompanied by that strength in the stock price, we're seeing some really good indications here that this company is trading at a really, really good valuation. I think the analysts here are agreeing. We're seeing 153% to the high price target and to the mean price target of 105. That's a 41% upside. And this is not just one or two analysts, right? This is a widely covered stock. So there's a lot of sentiment behind that forward growth that AMD is going to see as well. So I do put a lot of stock in this very reasonable valuation for AMD. The next point here is crypto mining. So for those that don't know, GPUs are absolutely critical if you're building a crypto mining farm. AMD has seen a surge in sales due to that. Everybody that sells GPUs has seen that. On the consumer side, if you've gone out and tried to buy a new video card, you know the pain. I mean, prices have almost tripled, I think, in the GPU market. So fantastic for AMD. It's done nothing but drive sales in that GPU market. Personally, I think go forward, I think consumers, like me, that would like to go buy a new video card, they're going to start considering a CPU upgrade instead, which again is all good for AMD. So I think if the crypto mining trend continues the way it has been, this is nothing but good news for AMD. Of course, it's hard to predict, right? Who knows what's going to happen? But I think I think it has driven strong revenue to this point, and I think there's a really, really good chance it's going to continue to provide a nice tailwind for AMD. Last point I'll make here is Samsung. I think this one gets overlooked a little bit. I certainly didn't understand it till I dug back into some of the older news, but AMD is just about to enter the cell phone market. It's a market that they haven't been in to date. This deal with Samsung was announced back in 2019. Nothing really happened. It kind of snoozed through 2020. But we're now coming to the point where we're going to see some product announcements, I think, in 2021. There's not a lot of clarity on what it actually means in terms of numbers and all that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it's a whole new line of business for AMD. It's a completely new market. It's a growth vector that the business has not had in the past. And personally, I don't think it's priced into the stock right now, largely because we don't know the size of it and the benefits of it. I get that. But still, I think there's a potential for nothing but good news to open up in terms of what they're going to be able to accomplish with Samsung and this partnership go forward and what it's actually going to mean to the bottom line. Nothing but great news for these guys, I think, coming in 2021.
Let's talk about risk.
Okay, so let's see if we can build a bear case and look at some of the bad news and some of the downside risk. The first point here I'll make is this Xilinx merger. It's risky. Any acquisition of this size is risky. There's a million ways that mergers fail. The company fails to recognize cost savings and synergies and things like that. And really you just get this big, bulky, inefficient organization that is at odds with itself, and it just creates waste go forward. I've seen that personally in IT over the years. Mergers and acquisitions are really difficult amongst tech companies. So it could absolutely fail, I think, in terms of delivering additive value, right? And that's the other risk with an acquisition, is that you run the risk of just taking one business, combining it with another business, and the both of them are just performing, the way they would have separately, right? It's really no better. Like, we need 1 + 1 to equal 3, right? If 1 + 1 = 2, then the merger is a waste of everybody's time and money, and potentially there's downside risk. So we really, really need to see that this merger is going to deliver additional value go forward, and it's not clear yet that it will, right? So yes, it's going to open up, I think, that new market and that new growth vector for AMD into automotive, into IoT, 5G, the whole thing. But is it going to add synergy, right? Is it going to enable them to sell processors into those new lines of business, right? Is there a way they can take FPGA devices and actually add value into the server market, into the desktop market, or into GPUs? I don't know. It's not clear that will happen, right? So aside from the growth that they're going to see in those new markets, I'd really like to see some new product announcements. I'd like to see some cool new engineered solutions that combine FPGA technology with AMD's microprocessors. That would be pretty awesome news and make me feel better about the risk that they're taking on with the merger. The second thing I'll say here is that AMD is at risk of being in a legacy business with the x86 chip architecture. Some people claim that x86 is a dying architecture, that it's in decline. You look at what Apple's done with the move to the M1 system on a chip. A number of folks, key players, are moving to ARM-based CPUs. NVIDIA, I think, announced they're adding an ARM-based CPU onto their GPU cards. So they're moving away from not only x86 CPUs, right, but they're moving away from that centralized dependence and reliance on an x86 central processor and moving more and more processor capability onto the GPU. There's other players that are moving to ARM-based solutions in cloud and server operations. I think that's a key strategy for Amazon. AWS is heading that way and away from x86 because the economy of scale seems to be more in favor of ARM-based solutions than x86 architectures. So if this trend continues or accelerates, I think AMD is going to find itself in a bit of a secular decline, I guess, in terms of the x86 market. And that is going to mean nothing but cost in terms of R&D and pivoting to something else, whatever that is, or growing other lines of business while they try to recognize the potential decline in the x86-based business. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think the risk is there, and I think it's something we have to keep an eye on, and it would be nice to see that AMD has a plan to pivot if, in fact, it does happen in a year or 2 years from now, whatever it might be. The third thing I'll say on the bear case, I guess, is inflation. If inflation is real, if it persists past the temporary supply crunches in the chains that we're seeing, then I think there could be a hit to the consumer segment of AMD's business. Inflation is bad for consumer confidence. If people find that their wages are being eaten away by increased prices, then they're going to be less liable to upgrade PCs, gaming rigs, and this type of thing. So I think there could be a hit to the consumer segment of AMD's business if inflation is not brought under control, and if there's a real hit to the consumer side of things, people are not going to want to spend that money on PCs. There's an argument here to be made on the reopening effect for AMD. You could say that the previous strength in the latter part of 2020 and the first part of this year was driven by the lockdowns and the stay-at-home type of thing. It drove a lot of money, I think, into the consumer segment of PC infrastructure and upgrades and all that kind of thing. As reopening happens, then maybe that's less likely to happen. So are we at an end to that strong growth in revenue? Could be. So if revenue does in fact slow down over the next few quarters for AMD, that's not going to help the share price in the short term, and it could really be bad news in terms of buying now and potentially seeing a revenue decline over the next little while. The last point I'll make here is one that you will see out there if you read some of the bearish comments about AMD and the Xilinx merger. The bears will point out that the $35 billion acquisition is an all-stock deal. AMD is going to issue new shares in order to purchase Xilinx, and so this is going to dilute existing shareholders, right? It's a pretty massive dilution event at $35 billion. Personally, I think this is overblown. I think that this is not really dilutive if it is adding at least the equivalent amount of earnings value to the combined company as the value of the shares that you're paying for. So if you pay $35 billion in order to take in at least $35 billion, then it's neutral. It's not necessarily a dilutive event for shareholders. And if it's accretive to earnings, right? So if you can actually bring that $35 billion in and make more than that, 40, 50 billion, whatever it is, then it's the opposite of dilutive to shareholders, right? So especially if you don't own stock at the moment, I think you can completely discount the bearish aspect of this potential dilution because it's priced in, right? I mean, we're at the point now where the news was announced a year ago. We're at the point where shareholders have voted to approve it. So unless something disastrous happens to change the nature of the deal, I think any dilution is already priced in, and we're not likely to see any further, damage to the share price as a result. Okay, so let's sum it up here, right? The bull case, it's based on revenue growth. It's based on what I think is a perfectly reasonable valuation for the company, and it's based on the strength of new lines of business opening up with the merger with Xilinx, and those lines of business I think are pretty key, right? We're talking about lines of business with a really big total addressable market, a lot of growth potential, and a pretty exciting new line of business for an older company like AMD to pivot into. I think the bull case is really strong based on those three things. The bear case, I think it can be made based on potential market disruption from inflation. Maybe the temporary suspension of this reopening strength that's brought them to this point. And the biggest thing probably being potential merger risk, right? Like I say, it's difficult to pull this off and they're at risk. I think the key thing with the bear case, though, is that these are all near-term risks. And really, I think they're just operational realities that the company is experiencing from everyday operations, right? I don't think these are existential threats to AMD. I think these are just things that they're really always going to have to deal with. And I don't really think the bear case amounts to much at the end of the day. On the other hand, I think the fact that these new markets that are opening up for AMD are really underappreciated by the market, right? I think people aren't getting it. I think there's really an underappreciation of the potential for these new lines of business that AMD is going to get into. I think there's a really, really strong likelihood we're going to see a lot of really cool product announcements from AMD over the next year or so. And I think that makes them a really strong value buy based on what's happened to the price over the last little while. I think this dip is very viable, and I think any subsequent dip from here on in is even more viable. I actually have a position in AMD, and I'm looking to open more, if the price gets even more attractive. So guys, that's my story. Please throw the video a like, helps me out. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, and I'll see you all on the next one.